Let's do a little more practice with voltage measurements, both 1-point measurements and 2-point measurements. Here's a more complicated circuit I've drawn. I don't know if it does anything in particular, but it's got a plus 5-volt rail and a minus 5-volt rail, as well as a connection to ground. And I drew a switch in here, and this switch, I made clear that this switch is intended to be in its closed position. I could measure some voltages in this circuit with my voltmeter, literally holding the voltmeter up there, or maybe I'll just show the voltages across some of these elements. So perhaps I measure the voltage across R1, and I find out that it's 3.8 volts, and I measure the voltage across R2, and I find out that it's 3.2 volts. The voltage from minus 5 to plus 5, that's got to be 10. And so also must be the sum of this piece plus the voltage across the LED plus this. So just by subtraction here, I can see that if I did measure the voltage across the LED, it's got to be 3.0 volts. What about the voltage across that switch? Well, it's a closed switch. It's really one piece of metal because it's closed here. It's one piece of metal continuous from here to there. So there can't be any voltage difference from here to here. The voltage across that switch is not even worth indicating. It's 0 volts. Here's ground. Now, we think of ground as being 0 volts, but if I measure the voltage from here to there, it's got to be 5 volts because this potential is definitely 0. This rail is at minus 5, so it's 5 volts there, and I could measure these as well. Okay, so that was measurements, 2-point measurements, as if made with a digital voltmeter, and I can measure the difference of any 2 points. In fact, I could even measure the difference of these 2 points, which is, no surprise, also 5 volts. What about 1-point measurements? Well, typically you make those because you've got a scope, and your scope has its own reference to ground, and it's only got one input wire. It measures every voltage that it measures is with respect to ground. So let's say this is your scope probe that you're going around touching points in the circuit with. Well, let's check my 5-volt rail first. If I touch there, I really ought to measure 5 volts on the scope. I really ought to measure minus 5 when I touch there. And of course, if I touch ground, I ought to measure 0. Let's go and measure some of the other points. Well, this one, not so immediately clear, but this was minus 5. This is 3.2 volts higher than that. So I guess this would probably measure minus 1.8 volts. How about this? The potential of here or of here ought to be the same as each other because it's one continuous piece of wire and it's 0 volts across from there to there. So if I touch this point, I ought to measure what? Not 0. Only thing I can tell you to figure that out is, look, this is at 5 volts. This is 3.8 volts lower. So the measurement there is probably going to be 1.2 volts, positive 1.2 volts.